Wafube, peace and blessings, and welcome to a Simon Necronomicon lesson number 5. Sometimes I'm a little bit paused with introducing it because I'm so used to doing the raw talk episodes. Okay, and I also have an episode I do with Kian Booker, aka the God 720, called the OG Den, and we talk about history and different things of that nature. So I'll do some posts on it later. But before we begin, I want to get a little bit of viewer participation because in the previous video, I said there's academic evidence and studies that how Nimrod became Yahweh. So if y'all want me to do a video on that, that'll be a great next episode or a future episode, or I can just give you the references at the beginning of the next video. I thought I would say something about it since I promised to discuss it. The second thing, I have my Kindle here. Shucks, let me see. It kind of went out for a second, but just give me a break and it'll come back shortly. And I don't know, maybe I don't have power for this thing. Okay, there we go. It's starting to start up. Today's discussion will be talking about the Mad Arab's instructions on making an altar. Yes, the Mad Arab spoke about making an altar, and there's a reason for this. But before we begin, I thought that I would discuss a little bit about the last video that we had in discovering. It's not really a discovery, but mostly that the Necronomicon uses energy from the land of Erishkigal, the land of Ker. You know, that's its foremost basis. And so throughout the Necronomicon tradition, or even why it's even called an Necronomicon tradition, is because it's associated with death energy. That's why. And, you know, that tradition is the Mad refers to in the Simon Necronomicon as the cult before Babylon existed. So it's not, like I said last week, a lot of books, a lot of information about it. I think in more recent times, we can learn a lot in comparison to the cult of Santa Muerte. It's very compatible with the Necronomicon tradition. I think the Necronomicon is a little bit more of a broader tradition because you do deal with celestial powers and you deal with, powers of the underworld and the land of the living and nature energies. All those things are accessible to you. However, it's still fueled in its core from Ker. And actually, some of the instructions of the Mad Arab is to keep this power chained in Ker. You know what I'm saying? So I want to kind of touch on that in the video a little bit more in the future. But I did mention it yesterday, so I want to make sure that the clarification was clear that this is a primordial path, and that's why it's perceived a lot by people differently, but it does definitely have a very primordial underworld essence, is because it's dealing with Ker energy. Even when you're walking the gates, you're calling the watch and you're saying, rise up from the land of Ker, cease to be the sleeper, of Agura. So this is that type of energy. And for those who can't understand the use of death energy spiritually or whatever the case may be, I'm going to discuss this as we're talking about the Mad Arab's instructions for making an altar. You know what I'm saying? I want to read an excerpt from a book. I'm going to show you the book on the screen. And the reason why I'm reading it is because it gives you an idea about people who deal with chthonic worship and what it may entail and different things of that nature. I'll show you the book on the screen. Actually, I'll read the book while I'm sharing. It's on Amazon, and if you have Amazon Prime, you can read it for free. So I was talking to a brother earlier about this, so I think this will be exciting. And the name of the book is Santa Muerte Devotion 101, Answers and Explanation for Curious Readers and New Devotees. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because when you apply it to the Necronomicon tradition, the same principles apply. It's a very good book. It's simply read, and like you can see on the screen, if you have Kindle, you can read it for free. It's an excellent book, probably one of the best books written on the subject. I want to read you a passion, but notice that when I mentioned Santa Muerte, think about the Necronomicon underworld. And, the underworld in Necronomicon is two places. It's the celestial world and it's the land of the deceased. So this is the whole underworld, the whole Necronomicon rite is an underworld rite. So I want you to think about the mentality that goes with that tradition. And I'll start beginning here. It says, the Santa Muerte means death. She is not a spirit or a deity with dominion over death, but the personification of death. This distinction is important because spirits and deities are themselves subject to the power of death. When all the believer of the gods disappear, so too does that god die. Santa Muerte, on the other hand, is a constant force that exists whether or not you believe in her. She is a fact of life that does not require belief in order to be made real. If all the devotees of Santa Muerte were to suddenly disappear, she would not lose any of her power because human beings are not the only things alive in this universe. In fact, the very universe we call home is itself alive, which means that it will one day succumb to Santa Muerte as well, at which point a new beginning will be born. Since every death gives way to a new beginning, and since every new beginning must one day die, then it becomes clear that the power of Sancta Muerte is perpetual and never ending. And it goes on further. And it's a really excellent book because there's a lot of things in here that, I never even considered, on the level of just, using the D word and, what that means, spiritually, whatever. I mean, perhaps people in Tapalo, Mayambe and stuff like that have a more clear perception, you know what I mean? But it's interesting because Santa Muerte, like Orishka gals, is perceived as a feminine force, and life goes out from the woman and it returns to that world, you know what I'm saying? And nothing can escape that world, which is why the Dingir, they had to respect the policies of that covenant because that was something serious, and they respected enough that they invited her to a banquet in heaven, and they knew that she couldn't come up, but they did ask Namtar to come up and to grab a meal for her and to bring it back like you would invite a relative over and stuff like that. But the whole neck is based on a premise of a similar energy. So today I want to discuss the altar. There are instructions in the Simon Necronomicon about the creation of an altar and why that's important. We're going to touch on. But first, let's get to the actual passages that talk about the creation of an altar. And when we compare certain passages, we can see why it's important. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen again, pull this up, and okay, there we go. Boom. All right, that page looks very familiar, doesn't it? And we know that when the Mad Arab was sleeping, he had this dream, and he had so all these things, and he was given instructions on how to open the gate. So these are the three sigils that are carved, or that was on the stone that was a gate to the outside, and this was the amulet that was his amulet for protection. Okay, and then he explains the sigils and what they mean in the text, and then he goes on to say, and this is very important, these seals, to be effective, must be graven on stone and set in the ground, okay, or set upon the altar of offerings, or carried to the rock of invocations, or engraved on the metal of one's god and goddess and hung about the neck. but hidden from the view of the profane. So that's the instructions for building an altar, right? What happens a lot of times is when people see the signs, they automatically think, hey man, you know, that those signs are for the Agamasaratu, and that's correct. However, it's also for the altar. Now, it's funny because I just read a passage about Santa Muerte, and if you read the testimony of the Mad Arab, now that we know that he specifically said to make an altar using those signs, or that they should be on one's altar or around one's neck, right? Because the Necronomicon can also be, our flesh and blood. I mean, it's also another correspondence. But in making those signs, you know what I'm saying, it's very important that we set something up and place it on our altar, all right, and have at the house. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Santa Marta, some people just light a candle to her. A person, the first exercise that the Mad Arab did ultimately was light a candle next to those three signs. You see what I'm saying? That's an exercise. You know what I'm saying? That's how the altar is anointed, even before we get into all this other stuff. And we can make a comparison by looking at another section. Let me pull this up, a very famous section. When we look at the instructions for the watcher, we can see that it also mentions uh, the bowl of the watcher, but distinctly another use of the signs in reference to the altar. Let me scroll this back down again because I picked out the wrong page. So I'm sorry about that, people. Let me go back to the page, the conjuration of the watcher. Man, it's so great to talk about this stuff on YouTube, without getting, excessive, whatever. Okay, let's pull this up. Okay, there we go. All right, this is absolutely excellent. So let me just move my picture out the way. Um, Let me take a look. Okay, it's in the beginning. It says, "This is the book of the conjuration of the watcher. The formula is I receive from the scribe of Enki, our master and lord of all magic. Great care must be taken that this untamed spirit does not rise up against the priest. And for that reason, a preliminary sacrifice must be made in a clean new bowl with the appropriate sigils scribed thereupon, being the three gray carven signs of the rock of my initiation, which are." So he mentions that these signs were also relative to the same signs that was on his rock of initiation. The Agamasaratu was not his rock of initiation, right? It was a separate stone that was on the rock of his initiation, and that's very important. Now it mentions that the signs are to be engraved upon the sword of the watcher, upon the bowl. Okay. And we can also see that ultimately the information that he received was indeed from Enki. Ultimately, it was from Enki and from Nebo to Enki. So that tells us that all those energies, uh, in a way, are kind of all netherworld energies. Like I wouldn't say netherworld in the sense of the realm of Rishkagal, but in the whole context of everything, you're dealing with the underworld, whether it's in the sky or whether it's, beneath beneath us and dealing with the stars that are below the horizon, right? And so that would constitute an underworld star. I want to touch on one other thing, um, that I think it gives us a reason why. Um, Let me just see just one passage, and then I'll really get into some real talking. Let me see, which it says, okay, in the Arilla text, it also talks about this. Okay. 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 All right. Um, all right. But the reason why the altar is really kind of important is because we learn that you should never use the Bandar symbol by itself. Okay. So if one wants to go into the Urilla text, they're told to use a cracked bowl. But those signs of Mashu should still be present because we are told never to use the Bandar singularly, right? And that's how that's done by having the three signs on the altar. So that way, whether you're using the Agamasaratu or the shattered bowl with a crack in it, the what do you call it, the dur and stuff like that, you still have those three signs present. I'm saying, and that's the important thing about that. And so, um, a person can, when they prepare their altar, they have the three signs on their altar. Maybe they can put it, however they can do it. Maybe they can carve it into a piece of wood and put it up there. Maybe they can craft it into a piece of metal and put it up there. Maybe they can have it on like a silk or like a tablecloth over the altar. It could be a little bit weird because if you have a bowl of fire up there, when you're using your Agamasaratu, you don't want things to burn. But it's beautiful fact that you can always have that present. Some people could be a little bit apprehensive, but once you set your altar up, you just light a candle on it and have those signs present, just like the Mad Arab did. And I'm sure you're going to see some communications and stuff like that, more specifically probably in the dream state, or whatever the case may be. But it's definitely a beautiful thing, So um, that's the situation with the altar, and that's how you can kind of tune into that energy. You can keep the house warm with that energy because you can have a lit candle when you come in. Maybe when you go to work, you could put it out, different things of that nature, but it keeps the presence. So he says for those signs to be effective, right, they should be on the altar or hung around one's neck. But I get more specification when they're put on the altar and they're used as the rock of one's initiation. Um, we can get into that passage because that's actually a good passage. Most of the times, to be honest with you, as far as like the work is concerned, although a lot of the energies in the neck can be looked up, like Inky and Nana, Rishkagal and stuff like that. But really, aside from the banishings and stuff, the gate walking thing, outside of like situations where mythologies that describe gates, that's cool. It shows that, hey, there was a valuable system of gate walking from way back. But really, with the neck gate walking is specific to its own gnosis, right? So this is the only, system that has a melting pot of certain things. And for that reason, the testimony of the man Arab is a metaphoric mythology filled with symbolism to explain what, um, what, how does the text work? You see what I'm saying? So when you hear about the guy and he says that, hey, I went to sleep, well, let's read it for what it is. And then you can kind of see what the first right is. Uh, let me see. Okay. Um, okay. where he builds a fire and stuff like that. Okay. Um, okay. All right. Okay, so let's go into this again. I'm gonna share my screen again, and y'all can see what I'm reading as I'm reading it. Okay, so here we go again, and he says right here, he says, I came upon a gray rock carved with 3 strange symbols. It stood as high as a man, 6 feet, and as wide as a bull. It was firmly in the ground, and I could not move it. Thinking no more of the carvings, save that they may be the work of a king to mark some ancient victory over enemy, I built a fire at its foot to protect me from the wolves that wander in those regions, and went to sleep. For it was night, and I was far from any village, being Bet Debarabi. Being about 3 hours away from dawn, in the 19th of Shabbatu, which I think is a sign of Scorpio, I was awakened by the howl of a dog, perhaps of a wolf, a watcher figure, uncommonly loud and close at hand. The fires had uh, the fire had died to its embers, and these red glowing coals cast a faint dancing shadow across the stone monument with the 3 carvings. I began to make haste to build another fire at once, and the gray rock slowly began to rise as though it were a dove. I could no more move, speak for fear that seized upon my spine and wrapped cold fingers around my skull. Okay, so that's definitely like underworld symbolism, and I mean, it's a lot of layers in those passages, you know what I'm saying? But basically, we can see that before he went to sleep, he lit a candle by the 3 carvings, and he really saw some stuff. And these carvings was said to be set forth by a king to mark some victory. And where that analogy of a king and a victory, man, it gets a little bit deep because, currently in the news, there's talk about Black Lives Matters. There's a lot of issues concerning race in America. And when you study the Necronomicon, not even Mesopotamian lore, but the Necronomicon, the king that he's talking about, right? Um, it discusses in the information of L.A. Waddell that there was a fight. There was a huge war, and it's been discussed in history. It was a war between the pre-Adamite Chaldeans and the descendants of Adam. Pre-Adamites, for those who know the doctrine, were people who were considered to exist, indigenous people, you know what I'm saying? And they had a certain technology. They were serpent worshippers, right? And so a new era began when the knowledge of what they were doing was overcame. So the 3 sigils actually, it kind of controls that, and that kind of sends mixed messages into the next. So we don't want to like sugarcoat the thing. So I'm just going to be raw with it as possible because it needs to be known. So basically, when you look at like, which is what gives the Necronomicon a certain edge. I'm not saying that um it's powerful in certain more powerful in certain things. It's a very powerful system, and the reason why I'm saying that is because just based on my own experience, when I would go into a willful Ganzir right, or go into the Arella, I would come across a lot of people who are into like Palo, Santa Marta, you know, these religions. So I knew that these things evolved around that realm. When I went into the celestial realms, those workers were not to be found. You see what I'm saying? So the bowl. It's called the Dur in Waddell's material, and it had inscribed these kings on it that were able to conquer um, uh, the indigenous people living far in the Far East. And from that time, it led to a new era. You know what I'm saying? And Waddell put it out that way. Who knows what, like, who was involved? But it was very interesting for me as studies at that time. But pretty much it was like you hear about India and the Aryan races coming in and doing whatever. This was something similar. You know what I'm saying? And so the thing about this is that you have a level of energy that um, can really put certain things to rest. You know what I'm saying? At the same time, that energy draws off the dragon current that people worship singularly. You see what I mean? At one time. So somewhere down the line, the development of the starry cults will utilize to battle the original serpent cults. And in some ways, the battle with Marduk and Tiamat probably did happen between two people, although it also occurred in the heavens. You know what I'm saying? And that's just what it was. You know what I'm saying? So stars rule certain events, and when those stars get close to each other and it's conflictual, they'll definitely break out a war on Earth with people who just are not aware of what is influencing them. And that's just what that is. And I thought that I would interject that there because um man, you should check it out. I think it's called it's a book by Waddell. I think it's called Makers of Civilization. That's the name of it, by L.A. Waddell. You used to be able to get it online as a PDF because a lot of his books was written like in the 1800s, so they're public domain. And then what happened was that um, as popularity of Necronomicon began to grow, people began looking for this material. Some people say, "Well, that was bigoted," but a lot of times, I don't really take any like. I don't take stuff like that personal because the information, even though the dude was bigoted, you can still learn a lot from the perspective of how they saw the history. You know what I'm saying? And so that's what they're talking about. And so I think what happened, just to keep it on the up and up, when you read um, the spell book, Necronomicon spell book, it mentions what happened to Sumerians. They went into Africa. They may have went into the darkest regions of Africa. Okay, let me just get on that for a second. That could have been a balance because maybe, some people were getting heat, like, what's up with this Waddell thing? This dude, he was, whatever. He's a bigot or whatever. But that's the same thing that was said by Malcolm X when they asked him about, how could you say that, black was from Asia? And he said, haven't you ever heard the Sumerians? That was a quote from Malcolm X. But here's the thing a lot of people don't understand. The Greeks wrote about the Canaanites' plight. They wrote about this plight long before modern racism was developed, right? The Greeks wrote about this. And they wrote that the Canaanites, the West Africans, originated from the land of Canaan. And evidently, when you look at the biblical epics of, Israel going through Canaan, then everyone knows how they were pushed out. Some people probably say, hey, man, what about the out of Africa theory? The out of Africa theory at this point is racist because when you look at Lucy, if you ever was to see Lucy, let me see if I could pull her up while we're talking, because I'm going to tell you how this thing works. What they do, what the scientific community does, they used to come up with these, what do they call it, scientific racism, with these theories and stuff, and it would be blatant. So what they do now is they hide it behind ideas in society that people will be more willing to accept, right? And that's how that thing works. Okay, so let's take a look at this, and I'll show you. Okay, what we're talking about. So we got to keep the Necronomicon, but it doesn't mean we always have to be talking about it. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, this is Lucy, right? This is Lucy. This is the old woman that was found. Who is she found at? I remember hearing about this in Ethiopia, and she's 6 million years old and all this stuff. And everybody's like, all the black people, like, yeah, I told you, da da, Africans the motherland. Okay, all right, and so they support this theory. You know what I'm saying? But then when you read about it, let me see if I could pull this up a little bit. Let me pull this up a little bit. It says Lucy is the common name of AL288-1. Several hundred pieces of fossilized bone representing 40% of the skeleton of a female of the hominin species Astrolopithecus afavinus. Now, since they use the word Lucy and they say she's the mother of everybody and she was found in Ethiopia, people don't even look at what the Latin term means, all right? So let's take a look at the Latin term and see what's going on. So they're not going to show it here because they don't want the controversy, right? But, oh yeah, here it is right here. This is Lucy. So this is where this is the Ethiopian that they're talking about. And this is where when black people saying like, yeah, scientists say we're from out of Africa, everybody's from out of Africa. This is who they're talking about. So basically what they're saying is that you're from a monkey and you seem to agree with it because you agree with the out of Africa theory without looking further into it. And that's the out of Africa theory. You know what I'm saying? Let me see. Let's take a look at some other pictures of Lucy and see, these bigoted ideas. This is crazy, bro. I ain't even getting into this no more because I just kind of left this alone years ago, B. You know what I'm saying? Let me show you another picture of Lucy. Share screen. This is Lucy. This is the one that they say everybody comes from. So basically they're saying that black people come from monkeys. That's the out of Africa theory because no one looks at the Latin term to see that they're not even talking about a human being, but there's some apes that walk upright. Okay. And of course, there's no protesting, there's no BLM, interception of what the scientific community is talking about. This is what they're saying. You know what I'm saying? This is just a side note. I don't want to go too far from what it was saying in the Necronomicon about the stone bowl and the carved signs or whatever. But that's just basically, what that is or whatever. In conclusion, oh man, you can't even make this stuff up, man. This is crazy. I wanted to get a little bit more clearer about clephotic spiritualism, clephotic spiritualism, and the mentality of people who are involved in it, and like that sort of thing. So let me pull up the screen again, and I read to you the 101 that we were talking about before, and this is on one of the pages. This is on page, I don't know, I had passed it, but I think it's on page like 20 something. But it says, Devotion to Santa Muerte is about the acknowledgement of death, the facing of death head on, rather than the avoidance of it. Death is not something that can be avoided, and facing it head on can be amazingly liberating. When we acknowledge death, dress it up in cloaks of different colors, and adorn it in the altars with fruits and flowers and booths, we acknowledge the finite nature of life, which in turn reminds us to cherish whatever life we have remaining. When we are able to come to terms with the fact that everything we love about this earth will one day come to an end, it puts us on notice that we must live life on our terms right here, right now. We must spend as much time as we can with the people that we love, and we must spend as much time as we can indulging in life's physical pleasures. We would not have been put on earth if we were not meant to find the good and the joy within it. Make no mistake, death is coming for you. Every breath you take only brings you closer to death's final embrace. You can try to ignore this fact and pretend that you will have forever to get around to things that make you happy, but you will only be disappointed in the end in this regard. It would be fair to characterize Santa Muerte devotion not as a obsessed with death, but as obsessed with life. And I think on that note, we compare those teachings with the Necronomicon tradition, and it's a wrap. And we're going to get more into that in a future episode. But thanks for joining in, and leave some comments in the comment section. I'll catch you later. Peace.